The heavy oak gavel didn't just hit the wood block. It sounded like a death knell echoing through the sterile, air-conditioned silence of the courtroom. Margaret stood there in her pressed floral blazer, clutching her designer handbag like a shield of righteousness, her face twisted into that signature sneer of suburban authority. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I looked her straight in the eye and realized she actually thought she had already won. How could she be so smug when she was trying to take a man's home for the crime of wanting to be free? The nightmare started 6 months ago with a simple click of a breaker. I was tired of the rolling blackouts and the skyrocketing utility bills that felt more like extortion than service. I invested my life savings into a state-of-the-art solar array, a sophisticated rainwater filtration system, and a Tesla Powerwall setup that made my little cottage on the edge of the woods entirely self-sufficient. I wasn't hurting anyone. I was just quiet. But in the eyes of the Pine Crest Homeowners Association, silence is a rebellion. Margaret, the HOA president and self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, showed up on my porch with a clipboard and a scent of overpowering lavender perfume that made my nose itch. She didn't say hello, she just pointed a manicured finger at my roof. Do you really think those ugly glass slabs fit the aesthetic of our community, Arthur? I said, the sound catching in my throat as I smelled the damp earth of my garden behind her. I told her they were high-efficiency panels, but she didn't care about efficiency. She cared about the rulebook. Within a week, the letters started arriving. First, they were warnings. Then came the fines. $200 a day for unauthorized exterior modifications. Another $100 for failing to connect to the municipal water line. I remember sitting on my porch, watching the sunset reflect off my panels, feeling the cool evening breeze, and wondering why my independence felt like a declaration of war to these people. Why does it bother you so much that I don't need your grid? Margaret didn't just want my money, she wanted my submission. She gathered the board and filed a formal lawsuit to lien my property, claiming I was a public health hazard and a blight on property values. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I spent nights hunched over old property records, the yellowed paper smelling of dust and forgotten history, searching for a way out. When we finally stood before Judge Miller, Margaret's lawyer, a guy who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of pomade, gave a soaring speech about the sanctity of community standards. He called me a rogue element. He looked at me with such disdain you'd think I was dumping toxic waste into the local stream instead of just catching rain. Margaret sat in the front row, nodding along, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. Can you believe the nerve of this woman? She actually smirked when her lawyer suggested that my off-grid lifestyle was a sign of mental instability. I felt a surge of cold fury, but I forced myself to breathe, counting the seconds, waiting for my turn. When I finally stood up, I didn't reach for a legal brief. I reached for a rolled-up, tattered map from 1954. Your Honor, I began, my voice trembling slightly before finding its rhythm. The plaintiff claims I am violating the bylaws of the Pine Crest HOA. But there is a fundamental flaw in their argument that they seem to have overlooked in their haste to collect my soul. I walked over to the evidence table, my boots clicking sharply on the linoleum. I laid out the original survey of the land before the Pine Crest development was ever built. Look closely at Plot 42B, which is my home. Margaret leaned forward, her brow furrowing, that confident smirk beginning to flicker like a dying light bulb. I pointed to a faint, jagged line running along the eastern ridge. This line represents the historical boundary of the Miller estate, which was subdivided in the 70s. When Pine Crest was incorporated, they drew the HOA boundaries based on a simplified tax map, not the legal metes and bounds of the original deeds. My house, which was the original farmhouse on this land, was explicitly carved out of the subdivision agreement to settle a family inheritance dispute 40 years ago. I am surrounded by the HO, but I'm not, and have never been, the part of it. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. I could hear the hum of the overhead lights and the distant sound of a siren outside. Margaret's lawyer scrambled, flipping through pages, his face turning a shade of red that matched Margaret's lipstick. "That's impossible," he stammered. "We've been sending him newsletters for years." I left, and it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in months. "Receiving your junk mail doesn't mean I've signed away my property rights." I produced the title insurance affidavit, a document I had spent 3 weeks and a small fortune to verify. It was the smoking gun. The document clearly stated that my property held an easement of independence and was excluded from any future mandatory associations. Judge Miller peered over his spectacles, looking at the map and then at Margaret, who was now vibrating with rage. "Is this true, counsel?" The lawyer couldn't even look at him. He just looked at his shoes. The judge turned back to me, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It appears, Mr. Bennett, that you are indeed a sovereign island in a sea of bureaucracy." Margaret stood up, her chair screeching against the floor like a wounded animal. "This is a technicality. He's ruining the harmony of our street. He's different." The judge didn't even look at her. He slammed the gavel down again, but this time it felt like a victory chime. "Case dismissed with prejudice." And since the HOA acted with what I perceive as reckless disregard for the actual legal boundaries of their jurisdiction, I am awarding the defendant full legal fees and a civil penalty to be paid by the association for harassment. Margaret let out a gasp that sounded like a tire deflating. She looked at me, her face pale, the lavender scent now smelling like rot. She had tried to use the law as a leash, and instead, it had become a noose for her own ego. I walked out of that courthouse into the bright, unfiltered sunlight. The air felt cleaner, sharper. I drove back to my house, pulled into the driveway, and looked at my solar panels. They were glistening, soaking up the free energy of the sun, beautiful and defiant. I wasn't just a man in a house anymore. I was a reminder that the system only has power over you if you forget who you are. The Karen of the neighborhood had tried to extinguish my light to make her own dim world look brighter, but she failed. As I sat on my porch that night, watching my lights flicker on, powered by nothing but the sky and my own resolve, I realized that the greatest form of justice isn't just winning a case, it's living a life that no one else can dictate. Independence isn't just about wires and pipes, it's about the boundary of your own soul. If you stand your ground and do the work, the truth will eventually find its way home, and the walls built by bullies will always crumble under the weight of their own arrogance.